What if the strongest walls ever built weren't meant to shield power or treasure, but something far more precious, the laughter and lives of children? Across the medieval world, hidden in plain sight, stand fortresses with a secret purpose. These weren't just castles designed to repel invaders or showcase a ruler's might. They were sanctuaries, meticulously crafted to protect the youngest and most vulnerable. Picture this: towering stone walls, not to intimidate but to cradle, moats not just as barriers but as silent promises of safety, every archway, every hidden passage, whispering the same urgent question: how do you build a world where the innocent can thrive? The emotional blueprints behind these structures reveal a side of the Middle Ages we rarely hear about. Beyond the battles and sieges, there were communities who poured their hopes into mortar and stone, creating shelters where children could grow up untouched by the chaos outside. Think of the carvings tucked into chapel corners, tiny handprints pressed into wet plaster by the very children these walls were meant to protect, or the narrow staircases, deliberately winding to confuse attackers, but wide enough for a child's hurried footsteps. These weren't accidents of design, they were acts of love frozen in time. So why does this matter today? Because these fortresses are more than ruins, they're mirrors. They show us what societies value when survival is on the line, and in their shadows, we find stories of resilience that still resonate. How did a single room tucked deep within a castle's heart become a classroom during wartime? Who were the unsung architects who prioritized playrooms over armories? Over the next minutes, we'll walk these forgotten halls together, decoding the symbols and strategies that turned cold stone into warmth. By the end, you'll never look at a medieval wall the same way again. Because some legacies aren't written in history books, they're carved into the very places meant to outlast them. The origins of these child-centric fortresses tell a story of desperation turned into determination. When invaders swept across the countryside or plague emptied entire towns, communities faced an impossible choice: how to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The answer emerged in stone and mortar. Wealthy merchants, noble families, even monastic orders poured resources into buildings that defied convention. Picture a castle stripped of its throne rooms and banquet halls, where every design choice whispered one priority: the children come first. High walls weren't just tall, they were unscalable, smooth to deny footholds. Gates were reinforced not with iron spikes for intimidation, but with hidden latches only the caretakers knew. And those winding corridors, they led not to treasure vaults, but to secret gardens where laughter could still echo safely behind barriers. What made these places truly remarkable was their intentional rejection of military logic. Traditional castles flaunted their strength, but child sanctuaries disguised theirs. From the outside, many appeared unremarkable abandoned granaries, repurposed chapels blending into the landscape to avoid drawing attention. Inside, though, they were labyrinths of safety. Architects borrowed tricks from nature, like honeycomb storage rooms that could hide dozens in plain sight, or ventilation shafts disguised as decorative flourishes to ensure fresh air during long sieges. Even the placement of windows followed a radical new rule: no direct line of sight from outside, so attackers couldn't glimpse the young faces within. Perhaps most revealing were the small touches that served no tactical purpose. Crude drawings scratched into walls by children taught their letters in these makeshift schools. Courtyards with worn patches where games were played under watchful eyes. These weren't just shelters, they were attempts to preserve normalcy in a world gone mad. When a society rebuilds its entire concept of defense around the vulnerable, It leaves behind clues not just about survival, but about love. And that's the real secret these walls still whisper today. These fortresses didn't just rely on thick walls and barred gates. They reimagined every architectural detail through the lens of a child's safety. Take those rounded staircases, for example. While traditional castles had steep, narrow steps to slow invaders, these sanctuaries featured gently curving stairs with low risers, designed so little feet could climb without stumbling. Even the handrails were set at a child's height, worn smooth by generations of small hands gripping them for balance, and those famously small windows. They weren't just about keeping arrows out, they were placed high on the walls, not only to deter climbers but to let in sunlight while keeping the world's dangers at a distance. Inside, the light would pool in warm patches on the floor, perfect for reading or quiet play. Then there were the courtyard spaces that defied the grim reputation of medieval strongholds. Unlike the stark training yards of military castles, these were vibrant oases. Fruit trees provided shade and snacks, while low walls doubled as benches for storytelling. Archaeologists have found remnants of hopscotch grids etched into the flagstones and shallow troughs that once held water for sailing toy boats. These weren't austere survival bunkers. They were ecosystems of normalcy where children could forget, even briefly, that danger lurked beyond the walls. But the most ingenious innovations were the ones you'd never notice at first glance. Builders sourced stone and timber from nearby quarries and forests, ensuring the structures blended seamlessly into the local landscape, no towering citadels drawing unwanted attention. Some designs even mimicked abandoned farmsteads, their true purpose hidden behind weathered doors. And beneath many of these sanctuaries lay networks of tunnels, wide enough for a line of children to escape single file, emerging in village basements or dense thickets. These routes were practiced monthly, turning evacuation into a game to keep fear at bay. What's striking is how these features served dual purposes. The same rounded corners that prevented injuries also softened the building's aura, making it feel less like a fortress and more like a home. Narrow hallways weren't just defensible choke points, they created intimate spaces where a caregiver could easily monitor both ends. Even the choice of wood for doors mattered. Lighter varieties allowed children to open them independently, fostering a sense of control. Every decision whispered the same message: you are safe here. And that may be the most revolutionary innovation of all architecture that didn't just protect bodies but nurtured minds. Hidden within these designs lies a language of symbols waiting to be decoded. The stone guardians watching over these sanctuaries were more than decorations. They were silent sentinels carved with purpose. Walk through one of these forgotten gateways, and you'd find angels with wings outstretched not toward heaven, but downward, as if sheltering those below. Grotesque gargoyles perched not to funnel rainwater, but to stare unblinking toward approaching threats, their exaggerated features designed to fascinate children rather than frighten them. Even the mythical beasts took on new roles: dragons curled protectively around doorways, their scales textured so small fingers could trace them like a tactile storybook. But the true magic lay in the hidden messages. Masons chiseled prayers into foundation stones, turning entire walls into whispered blessings. Some inscriptions were practical: the north wind brings sickness, carved near ventilation shafts, while others offered comfort, like the recurring phrase, "Beneath this roof, no child walks alone." The most poignant were the interactive ones: letters of the alphabet carved at child height in chapel pillars, or counting rhymes etched along garden paths where caretakers taught numbers while strolling. These weren't random scratches, they were a language of care where every symbol served double duty as both protector and teacher. sacred geometry transformed cold calculus into warmth. Builders laid out courtyards as perfect circles, no corners for danger to hide, while staircases spiraled upward following the Fibonacci sequence, believed to channel harmony. Some towers aligned with solstice sunrises, flooding nurseries with light on the longest day of the year, a celestial reassurance that darkness wouldn't last. Even the placement of buildings within the landscape followed ancient protective patterns. Archaeologists have found sanctuaries arranged like the constellation Ursa Major, its bowl forming a sheltered central square where children gathered under the real stars each night. What makes these symbols extraordinary is how they evolved under pressure. Early sanctuaries featured overt religious imagery, but as attacks increased, the designs grew subtler. Hidden Madonnas in floral motifs, or guardian saints disguised as ordinary townsfolk in friezes. One fortress near the Baltic coast even encoded its protection in maritime symbols, lighthouses whose beams pointed to safe routes, or knots in wooden beams tied in sailors' lucky patterns. The message was clear to those who knew how to look. This place was under unseen guardianship. Behind every chisel mark stood the forgotten heroes of this story, the artisans who embedded hope into stone. Unlike cathedral builders seeking glory, these craftsmen often worked anonymously, leaving only their protective marks as signatures. A quarryman might carve his personal safeguard, a tiny hand gripping a hammer into a cornerstone. Stained glass artisans pressed fragments of cobalt and ruby into windows not for beauty, but because certain colors were believed to repel evil spirits. Even the humble tilers contributed, arranging floor patterns that doubled as labyrinth games to occupy anxious minds during sieges. The most revealing creations were those made with children's hands. In several sites, archaeologists have found soft sandstone blocks set aside in courtyards, their surfaces covered in generations of youthful carvings, wobbly suns, stick figure families, even practice signatures. These weren't defacements, they were encouraged. Some caretakers deliberately left patches of fresh plaster for children to imprint their hands alongside the masons, creating a living record of who the walls were built to protect. Today, those tiny fingerprints in the mortar may be the most powerful symbols of all, proof that safety isn't just about keeping danger out, but about holding innocence in. And now we turn to the people who transformed these symbols into sanctuary, the architects of hope who saw vulnerability not as weakness, but as worth building a fortress around. The architects of these sanctuaries carried wounds invisible to the eye, monks who'd buried entire monasteries during plagues, stonemasons who'd outlived their own children in wars, widowed noblewomen who redirected their fortunes toward protection rather than revenge. Their genius lay not in rejecting the darkness of their times, but in refusing to let it define the next generation's world. Take Brother Anselm's surviving notebook from 1324. Between precise diagrams of buttresses, he scribbled reminders like, "Place the lavender hedge here for night terrors," or "south-facing dormitory windows for winter light therapy." These weren't just builders, they were healers wielding compasses instead of scalpels. What set their designs apart was an almost radical attention to psychological safety. While military architects obsessed over kill zones and enfilades, these visionaries mapped out calm zones, strategic alcoves where a distressed child could retreat without feeling trapped. They studied how sound traveled, angling ceilings to carry lullabies from caretakers' quarters while muffling outside screams during attacks. Some incorporated worry chambers, small rooms with thick walls where older children could voice fears without terrifying the little ones. The famous double-door system seen in Bavarian sanctuaries served this dual-purpose: outer doors sturdy enough to stop a battering ram, inner doors padded and decorated with pastoral scenes to create visual reassurance the moment danger passed. Daily life in these refuges followed rhythms that would feel strangely familiar today. Dawn began not with battle drills, but with light lessons, children tracing the journey of sunlight across specially placed mirrors that projected constellations onto floors, turning astronomy into play. Meals were served in staggered shifts at kidney-shaped tables, a design that allowed caretakers to monitor every child's appetite without crowding. Afternoons featured wall walks along specially designed parapets, low inner walls where toddlers could pretend to stand guard safely, their cheers carrying further than any watchman's horn. These routines weren't mere distractions, they were psychological armor, giving children the illusion of control in uncontrollable times. The true test came when danger actually knocked. Here, the architect's foresight shone brightest. In the Alpine sanctuary of St. Hedwig, for example, siege preparations looked unlike any other fortress. Rather than sharpening weapons, caretakers rehearsed the humming defense, teaching children to collectively chant sacred tones that echoed through acoustic chambers, designed to drown out the sounds of violence outside. Storage rooms doubled as theaters for impromptu puppet shows during lockdowns, with stockpiles of dried apples distributed as actors' wages. Even the latrines were engineered as places of refuge, ventilated and soundproofed, with hidden shafts for passing notes to reassure siblings separated during emergencies. Perhaps most moving are the traces of children's own contributions to these systems. At Montclair Abbey, the famed butterfly doors were allegedly designed after a 6-year-old refugee described her dream of escape routes light as wings. In northern France, the spiral layout of a sanctuary's herb garden matches a teenage girl's doodle found pressed between floorboards, her vision of a path that always leads home. These weren't just shelters built for the young. In the best cases, they were built with them, adapting as their needs evolved. What emerges from studying these spaces is a profound truth about protection. It's not truly strong unless it makes room for softness. The architects knew that 4 walls and a roof couldn't heal trauma, but walls with finger-painted murals just might. Their legacy challenges our modern ideas of security, asking whether we've sacrificed too much comfort for the sake of caution. As you walk through any old building now, look closer. You might find the ghost of a handprint in the plaster, or a stair rail worn smooth at 3 feet off the ground, silent witnesses to the radical notion that safety should feel like belonging. Life inside these walls was a careful dance between normalcy and vigilance, where every lesson planted seeds of resilience. Morning sunlight would filter through high windows as children gathered for circle time on woven mats, not with fairy tales, but with practical rhymes that doubled as survival mnemonics. Read at night, Shepherd's Delight taught weather patterns, while counting games included the number of steps to the nearest hidden tunnel. Even the youngest learned to identify medicinal herbs in rooftop gardens, their small fingers carefully plucking chamomile to soothe nightmares or yarrow for scraped knees. These weren't just skills, they were quiet acts of defiance against a world that had tried to extinguish their future. The elders who tended these sanctuaries became living libraries. A blacksmith might teach metalwork by having children mold candle wax into tiny tools, safe practice for hands too young for forges. Midwives showed girls how to weave dolls from clean rags, their stitches secretly demonstrating wound binding techniques. Storytelling took on new layers. The classic Three Little Pigs became a lesson on structural engineering, with debates about which materials could withstand wolfish sieges. Humor was weaponized. 2 silly songs about the knight who forgot his pants diffused tension during storms or distant battle noises. Laughter, after all, was proof that fear hadn't won. During crises, these routines transformed seamlessly into lifelines. When scouts spotted approaching raiders, the usual afternoon treasure hunt might suddenly hide emergency rations in familiar play areas. Older children took pride in their roles as light keepers, ensuring every lantern had oil, while little ones practiced mouse steps, moving silently to predetermined safe corners. The courtyards, typically alive with games, could become open-air clinics where teens applied their herb knowledge to dress wounds. What looked like chaos to an outsider was actually a well-rehearsed symphony of mutual care. Archaeologists have found poignant evidence of this dual existence: a slate board in Normandy with arithmetic problems on one side and a charcoal sketch of armed men on the other. A hopscotch grid in Bohemia where the numbered squares also marked distances to underground cisterns. These children were learning to live in two worlds at once, one of bedtime stories and scraped knees, another of watchtowers and whispered alarms. Yet the miracle was how joy persisted. Handprints in a Bavarian chapel's fresco show traces of berry juice, likely from a clandestine snack during art lessons. Even under siege, someone made sure there were still berries to stain small fingers. The fortress's true triumph wasn't just surviving crises, but how they measured time between them. Seasonal festivals were reinvented maypoles wrapped with ribbons color-coded to signal safe routes, winter solstice candles placed in windows to guide lost travelers to Sanctuary. Birthdays became sacred events, with each child's name added to a wall of years in edible ink. So if supplies ran low, the community could literally consume their history rather than lose it. These rituals anchored children to something greater than fear, the unbroken chain of those who came before and would come after. Now we come to the ultimate test, when the walls shook and the night air filled with smoke. How did these sanctuaries fare when danger breached the gates? The answers lie in the scars left behind. When the torches appeared on the horizon and the earth trembled with approaching hooves, these fortresses played their most cunning game, turning weakness into weapon. Unlike traditional castles that met threats with brute force, child sanctuaries specialized in the art of vanishing. False facades swung open to reveal empty halls, their real inhabitants already slipping through. Blind corridors, passages designed with irregular angles to confuse even the sharpest senses. Some kept decoy hearths burning with slow-release resins to mimic the smell of recent occupation, while others staged abandoned toys in courtyards to suggest a hasty retreat. The goal wasn't victory in battle, but the far more delicate task of making danger lose interest. Guards trained for these moments with scripts more intricate than any sword drill. At the first alarm, their priority wasn't manning the ramparts, it was activating what monks called the theater of absence. Sentries might appear to flee conspicuously toward fake bolt holes, drawing pursuers away from the real escape routes. Historical accounts describe ghost sentinels, articulated dummies rigged to creak on ropes along parapets, their movements timed to suggest a rotating watch. One Venetian sanctuary even employed trained doves to flutter from specific windows at set intervals, creating the illusion of routine activity while the children moved like whispers through submerged tunnels. The true genius lay in how these defenses accounted for children's natural behaviors. Hidden latches were placed at adult height to prevent curious hands from triggering them accidentally. Escape tunnels had smooth, downward-sloping floors so toddlers could be carried swiftly without tripping hazards. Some storerooms doubled as panic rooms, stocked not just with food, but with wax tablets and colored clays to keep little hands occupied during tense waits. Even the architecture played psychological roles. Rounded corners in hiding chambers prevented shadows that might reveal a child's silhouette, while strategically placed wind chimes masked telltale coughs or cries. Records from the siege of Montevid in 1421 tell of invaders who camped for weeks outside what they thought was an abandoned priory, never realizing its vaulted cellar held 80 children practicing arithmetic with pebbles. The caretakers had drilled them to communicate through tapped codes on water pipes, their lessons continuing uninterrupted as scouts tromped overhead. Similar stories echo across Europe, a Hungarian stronghold where attackers burned empty dormitories while children slept safely in camouflaged haylofts, or a Scottish tower house whose collapsing outer stair was actually a counterweighted diversion. What made these places truly unconquerable wasn't their physical barriers, but their understanding of human nature. Invaders expected resistance or riches. Finding neither, they often moved on. The few who pressed deeper encountered architectural riddles, staircases that ended into blank walls, the real steps hidden behind pivoting panels, or wells that were actually ventilation shafts for underground chambers. Some fortresses took deception further, with treasure rooms conspicuously left ajar to satisfy looters' expectations, while the real valuables, the children, remained unseen. This web of illusions didn't just protect little bodies, it shielded their sense of security. Children who experienced sieges often described them later as strange games, recalling how caretakers turned quiet time into thrilling hideouts or repurposed laundry chutes as secret message tubes. The structures themselves became co-conspirators in their safety, with every hidden nook whispering, "You are the secret the world can't find." As whispers of these designs spread, they adapted to their new landscapes like protective folklore. Alpine versions incorporated avalanche shelters into their escape routes, while coastal refuges used tidal caves that filled with seawater at predictable intervals. The next chapter of their story lies not in isolation, but in connection. How a pan-European network of sanctuary builders shared knowledge through coded blueprints and wandering artisans. Their legacy wasn't just in stones that stood, but in the unbroken chain of small hands that passed through them unharmed. From the snow-draped peaks of the Alps to the sun-bleached islands of the Aegean, a remarkable pattern emerges, identical solutions born worlds apart. High in the Andes, fortress builders carved entire nurseries into cliff faces, accessible only by rope ladders that could be reeled up like fishing lines. Meanwhile, along the Nile Delta, communities constructed floating sanctuaries disguised as reed barges, their walls woven tight enough to mute a child's cry across still waters. Distance meant nothing when it came to safeguarding the young. Necessity became the mother of parallel invention. Japan's Shugendo monks perfected perhaps the most poetic adaptation. Their mountain temples featured nightingale floors, boardwalks engineered to chirp like birds underfoot, alerting caretakers to approaching danger while delighting children with nature's mimicry. Orphanages doubled as spiritual academies where wooden practice swords hung beside abacuses, blending self-defense with arithmetic. In monsoon seasons, entire sections of these structures could be disassembled and moved uphill on bamboo sleds, leaving false trails in the mud to confuse trackers. Scandinavia took cues from the land itself. Families repainted their forest-stave churches every autumn to match the changing foliage, while underground bunkers hid beneath the iconic sod roofs of longhouses. Children learned to navigate by fox paths, routes marked with innocuous carvings on tree trunks, visible only to those taught the code. During the long winter darkness, caretakers used the aurora's glow to illuminate safety symbols painted with luminescent lichen extracts, turning the very sky into a guide. The Maya approached protection as both science and sacred duty. Their jungle refuges featured speaking walls, precisely angled surfaces that amplified whispers between sentry posts while distorting outside noises into indecipherable echoes. Stepped pyramids housed rainwater collection systems disguised as ceremonial pools, their overflow channels engineered to sound like rushing streams that masked nighttime evacuations. Even their famed ball courts served dual purposes. The towering stone rings became anchor points for emergency rope bridges when invaders approached. What binds these disparate designs is their profound respect for local context. Alpine shelters incorporated glacial meltwater channels as natural moats that froze solid in winter, creating impenetrable barriers. Greek island sanctuaries used sea caves with tidal calendars, their entrances submerged during predictable hours to deter intruders. In Persia, wind tower architecture passively cooled nurseries while filtering dust storms, proving protection wasn't just about security but quality of life. This global tapestry reveals something startlingly modern: child safety as a universal language. Whether carved in runes or painted in hieroglyphs, the same principles reappear: controlled sightlines for supervision, materials that age gracefully under small hands, spaces flexible enough for both play and peril. A 15th century Icelandic manuscript captures it perfectly, advising builders to make the strong places soft and the soft places wise. Behind every variation lay shared priorities, not just survival but continuity. The Maori meeting houses of New Zealand featured interior posts carved with ancestral figures, their outstretched arms forming literal and metaphorical support beams for the next generation. West African compounds used laterite bricks that hardened upon exposure to air, their porous surfaces absorbing children's charcoal drawings like living scrapbooks. From the Himalayas to the highlands, cultures converged on one truth: a society's future depends on where it places its most vulnerable. The miracle isn't that these designs emerged independently, but that they answered similar questions in locally brilliant ways. How do you mask fear in familiarity? By turning evacuation routes into scavenger hunts in England, or making hiding places resemble haystacks in Provence. What's the sound of safety? The rhythmic scraping of Tibetan prayer wheels masking conversation, or Venetian glassmakers teaching orphans to shape decoy figurines whose tinkling covered footsteps. Now we must ask, who funded these extraordinary efforts? The answer reveals surprising alliances between piety and pragmatism. Patrons of these sanctuaries didn't just open their coffers, they stitched their values into the very foundations. Take the wool merchants of Flanders, who diverted fortunes from tapestries to toddler-safe turrets, embedding their guild symbols not in lavish town halls, but in the rounded corners of orphanage staircases. Or the Bavarian countess who auctioned her jeweled headdresses to fund laughter vaults, reinforced chambers where children could play during thunderstorms without hearing the thunder. Their motivations were as layered as the walls they built. For some, it was divine calculus, ledger entries balanced against heavenly favor. A Venetian shipbuilder's ledger from 1483 lists beams for a sanctuary right below donations to St. Mark's Basilica, with a scribbled note: God measures roofs not by their gold, but by the small heads they shelter. Other patrons played the long game. Textile magnates funded apprenticeships within sanctuary walls, knowing these children would someday weave their fortunes. Mining barons constructed dormitories near silver veins, not for child labor as critics assumed, but to train geologists who'd repay the debt in expertise. The Cistercian monks of Clairvaux left the clearest paper trail. Their parchment budgets show every candle, every loaf accounted for, with one recurring line item: reserved for futures unseen. The debates behind these investments reveal medieval pragmatism at its most poignant. In a recently discovered letter from Burgundy, a lord argues with his steward over doubling the sanctuary's bread budget. Would you have them remember us as men who counted crumbs while their bellies growled? Elsewhere, a mason's contract specifies extra pay for carving animal shapes into door handles, not as decoration, but so tiny hands may always find their way home in the dark. Even the wealthiest patrons understood true protection wasn't about grandeur. The famed Medici family's least-known legacy, funding plain limestone walls throughout Tuscany, unadorned but earthquake-proof, with one condition: every block must bear a child's handprint in the mortar before setting. What's astonishing is how these priorities survived even during famine and war. Tax records show villagers voluntarily tithed a child's share of harvests to sanctuary granaries before feeding their own. In Prague, butchers donated bones not for soup, but to be carved into arithmetic tokens, waste transformed into education. This collective investment created an unspoken covenant. If the children thrived, so would the community's soul. Yet the golden age of these fortresses couldn't last forever. As cannons rendered high walls obsolete and plagues depopulated entire regions, the sanctuaries faced their cruelest test not from invaders but from changing times. The very innovations that made them extraordinary became their undoing. The age of independent child sanctuaries couldn't withstand the tides of progress. As kings consolidated power and standing armies replaced marauding bands, the chaotic landscapes that birthed these refuges began to stabilize. By the 1600s, many of these structures stood at a crossroads too sturdy to abandon, yet outliving their original purpose. Some transitioned gracefully into new roles. The great sanctuary of St. Agnes in Provence became a girls' school where pupils still traced their fingers along walls etched with centuries-old alphabet lessons. Others met harsher fates, stripped for building materials or converted into granaries, their protective features buried under layers of plaster and pragmatism. Yet even in neglect, the bones of these buildings refused to forget. In 1843, workers renovating a Bavarian hospital stumbled upon a hollow wall filled with tiny leather shoes, emergency supplies left by long-dead caretakers. Decades later, a landslide in the Alps exposed a perfectly preserved panic room, with child-sized benches and walls painted with constellations, their positions matching the night sky from 5 centuries earlier. These accidental discoveries sparked curiosity, but it wasn't until the late 19th century that archaeologists began connecting the dots. The real breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a sewer repair in Ghent that uncovered a network of tunnels radiating beneath a former orphanage. Each passage ended at a different civic building: the bakery, the magistrate's house, even the cathedral. Local historians realized they weren't looking at utility tunnels, but escape routes designed so children could vanish into the city's heartbeat. This discovery ignited a wave of reevaluations across Europe. Scholars began noticing patterns: the recurring handprint motifs in mortar, the strategic placement of certain buildings on high ground with clear sightlines to nearby villages. What had been dismissed as eccentric architecture suddenly revealed its genius. Modern child welfare designers now study these sites with reverence. The trauma-informed orphanages of today echo medieval innovations: rounded corners to prevent self-harm, sound-absorbing materials in conflict zones, even the deliberate use of warm-toned lighting to counteract institutional sterility. At a Copenhagen shelter built in 2016, architects replicated the Fibonacci spiral staircases from 13th century sanctuaries after studies showed their proportions reduced anxiety in displaced children. The past's solutions are becoming the future's blueprints. Perhaps the most poignant rediscovery came from a crumbling Welsh tower house. Restorers removing 18th century paneling found the original walls covered in names not carved but written in charcoal by generations of children. Beside each name sat a small drawn symbol: a loaf of bread for those who'd shared meals, a candle for nighttime comforters, even a tiny sword marking protectors who'd stood guard during sieges. These weren't just graffiti, they were a living ledger of care, proof that safety isn't measured in stone thickness, but in the countless small acts of watching over one another. The walls may have faded, but their message endures. Protection isn't just about strength, it's about remembrance. Rediscovery began with curious scribbles in the margins of history, a parish ledger noting the stone house where no child wept, or a faded sketch in a merchant's diary showing a peculiar round tower with unusually small windows. 19th century antiquarians first dismissed these fragments as eccentricities until patterns emerged. In the Loire Valley, a local historian named Emile Durant noticed 3 separate castles with identical oddities, handrails exactly 3 feet high, interior courtyards without weapon racks, and chapel walls covered in faint chalk marks too orderly to be graffiti. His 1868 treatise, Les Forteresses Oubliées, sparked Europe-wide interest, though many colleagues still argued these were simply defective military designs. The proof came from below ground. Excavations at a ruined abbey near Salzburg uncovered a trove of artifacts that couldn't be explained away: miniature wooden swords with blunted edges, slate boards covered in shaky letters practiced hundreds of times, even a doll-sized quilt stitched from monastic vestments. Most telling were the shoes. Dozens were found deliberately concealed in walls and under floorboards, always in pairs, always tiny. Folklorists recognized the tradition, parents hiding footwear as spiritual safeguards, believing the scent of a child's steps could lead them home if lost. Archaeologists now view these caches as time capsules, each pair whispering, "We were here." Modern restoration teams face a delicate challenge. Traditional castle conservation prioritizes grand halls and battle scars, but these sites demand a different approach. At Mont Saint-Jean in Belgium, conservators use UV light to reveal layers of drawings on plaster stick figure families, lopsided houses, even a crude map of the fortress itself drawn by a child who likely never saw the outside world. The most moving discovery, a single word scratched over and over in different hands across 2 centuries: safe. Technology is unlocking secrets faster than ever. LiDAR scans of a Welsh hillside revealed subterranean tunnels radiating from a forgotten hospice, their routes aligning with long-demolished cottages, escape paths disguised as drainage ditches. Thermal imaging in Italian monasteries shows where thick walls conceal hidden chambers once warmed by body heat. But the real breakthroughs come from collaboration with unexpected experts. Pediatric psychologists recently analyzed sanctuary layouts and recognized intentional trauma mitigation, curved hallways preventing startling around corners, or elevated sleeping niches that subconsciously mimic treehouse security. What's emerging is a new kind of monument. Unlike castles celebrating conquest, these restored sites bear witness to vulnerability and its quiet triumph. Visitors now leave modern offerings, stuffed animals at the foot of ancient dormitory walls, or notes tucked into crevices where children once hid treasures. In Austria's Wachau Valley, a restored sanctuary runs an annual memory festival where locals reenact not battles, but bedtime stories told during sieges. The past isn't being preserved here, it's being kept alive. The ultimate testament lies in how these designs are inspiring contemporary safe havens. A Syrian refugee camp in Jordan replicates medieval calm corners with sandbag walls shaped like hugging arms. Tokyo's earthquake-proof kindergartens borrow the Fibonacci staircases proven to steady nervous legs. Most strikingly, a Canadian women's shelter recently incorporated blind corridors from 15th century blueprints, not to hide from danger now, but to give residents the psychological relief of invisibility when needed. As excavators brush dust from another tiny handprint somewhere in Europe today, they're not just uncovering history, they're retrieving an idea. That protection doesn't require hardness, just creativity. That resilience isn't about withstanding blows, but preserving tenderness beneath them. And perhaps most radically, that the measure of a society isn't in how it builds walls, but in who it places within them. The echoes of medieval sanctuaries hum in the walls of today's shelters for at-risk youth, though few realize they're following a blueprint centuries in the making. Walk into a modern trauma-informed group home, and you'll find the same principles that once guided stonemasons' softened edges where walls meet ceilings to ease anxiety. Courtyards dappled with sunlight to regulate circadian rhythms, even the deliberate use of warm ochre tones that 13th century builders sourced from clay pits for their calming effect. Architects now pore over illuminated manuscripts not for their artistry, but for their hidden wisdom. How a rounded doorway in a Swiss orphanage reduced night terrors, or why certain stairwell acoustics in Bavarian sanctuaries made lullabies carry further. The parallels are uncanny. Contemporary designers use sound-dampening panels where medieval monks hung woven tapestries, both serving the same purpose, to make whispers feel like embraces. But the real revelation lies in how these ancient solutions address modern crises. A shelter in Chicago's South Side recently redesigned its dormitory based on a rediscovered Florentine ledger. Bunk beds arranged in radial patterns so no child feels cornered, just as 15th century caretakers positioned cots to prevent nightmares. In refugee camps across Greece, humanitarian workers have adopted the blind corridor technique from Byzantine sanctuaries, creating meandering pathways that subconsciously slow racing hearts. Even the humble details carry forward. One Dutch facility reintroduced medieval-style worry stones, smooth river rocks kept in pockets for anxious fingers to trace, a tactile anchor first documented in a nun's diary from 1382. What's striking is how these designs prioritize psychological safety as fiercely as physical protection. Like their medieval counterparts, today's architects understand that locks alone can't heal trauma, but spaces can. A transitional home in Toronto features ceiling murals of constellations matching those painted in alpine sanctuaries, both serving the same purpose: to give restless eyes a focal point during panic attacks. In Oslo, a youth center's treehouse nooks directly echo the elevated sleeping niches found in Scottish tower houses, leveraging height to create subconscious security. The most profound borrowing, the intentional inclusion of imperfect elements, slightly uneven floor tiles in a New Orleans shelter, mimic the deliberate irregularities in medieval cloisters, teaching residents that safety doesn't require perfection. Now we turn to the living threads connecting past and present, descendants of sanctuary children who carry their ancestors' resilience like hidden compasses. In a village near Lyon, fourth-generation stoneworker Jacques Moreau still uses his great-grandmother's technique for testing mortar, pressing a child's hand into the mixture before it sets, just as she did while hiding in the very walls he now restores. Across the Atlantic, a trauma psychologist in Montreal traces her career choice to a family story about a 12th century ancestor who soothed frightened children by teaching them to count the stones in sanctuary walls, a distraction technique she unconsciously recreated with her patients using Lego bricks. Perhaps most moving are the oral traditions that survived centuries. A Kurdish grandmother in Stockholm teaches her grandchildren the same butterfly breathing exercise her own forebears learned during sieges, inhaling deeply while tracing wings painted on a sanctuary ceiling. In Kyoto, a calligrapher's steady hand stems from childhood practice copying alphabet carvings from a temple that once sheltered war orphans. These aren't just familial quirks, they're living proof that sanctuary isn't a place but a practice, one that rewires itself across generations. The ultimate testament lies in how these descendants are now shaping new safe havens. A third-generation firefighter in Marseille insists on designing stations with rounded corners and natural light after learning his great-great-grandfather helped evacuate children through castle tunnels. A school teacher in Quebec's Cree Nation incorporates story stones into her classroom, a tradition inspired by her ancestors' account of learning letters from carvings in a Norman fortress. Their collective message, the best protection, isn't just about building walls, it's about planting forests of belonging where roots intertwine across time. In the quiet corners of European villages where television signals fade and the internet feels distant, you'll find the real historians' grandmothers stirring stews who pause to describe the exact shade of blue in their great-grandmother's sanctuary cloak, or shepherds who point to ruins and recount lullabies passed down from children who slept there. These aren't just folk tales, they're living emotional archives. An elder in the Pyrenees might trace her finger along a fresco's chipped edge, recalling how her ancestor described counting its stars during a siege, each one memorized like a bead on a prayer rope. Over generations, the stories distilled into something purer than facts, a collective memory of what safety felt like when the world was anything but. What's remarkable is how consistently certain details surface across cultures. In Transylvanian kitchens, elders still mimic the rhythmic scraping of spoons against wooden bowls, the sound that once masked whispered instructions during raids. Norwegian fishing villages preserve the peculiar melody of a counting song used to calm children while tunnels were cleared of snow. These shared fragments reveal an unspoken truth. Trauma leaves fingerprints, but so does tenderness. The brain clings to sensory anchors, the smell of lavender stuffed in mattresses to ward off nightmares, the texture of a specific stone warmed by sunlight where toddlers nap. Psychological researchers studying these oral accounts noticed something startling. Survivors who recalled sanctuary life often described it in spatial terms, not chronological ones. A 90-year-old in Tuscany might struggle to name the year her mother was sheltered, but she could draw the exact dimensions of the singing corner where voices echoed strangely, making lullabies sound like they came from the walls themselves. This suggests these spaces didn't just protect bodies, they rewired perception. Danger existed out there, but in here was a separate universe with its own rules. The most poignant testimonies come from those who were children during World War II, sheltered in repurposed medieval sanctuaries. A Hungarian pianist still recalls the exact pattern of cracks in her hiding place's ceiling, which she turned into an imaginary musical staff. For her, those fissures weren't signs of decay, but proof the walls had endured before and would again. This phenomenon, finding agency in architecture, echoes through centuries. Modern therapists recognize it now as place attachment, but medieval caretakers understood it instinctively. They baked reassurance into the bricks, whether through hidden play spaces or deliberately imperfect carvings that whispered, "Nothing here demands perfection from you either." Yet the stories also carry shadows. In the Carpathian Mountains, a folk song about the bread that never ran out is always sung slightly off-key, a deliberate imperfection to honor the hunger it couldn't erase. Some descendants mimic the habitual tiptoeing of ancestors who learned to walk silently, even in safety. These aren't failures of the sanctuaries, but proof of their honesty. They couldn't erase war, only soften its edges. Perhaps that's why the tales endure, not as fairy tales of unbroken safety, but as testimonies of how fragile light persists in the darkest rooms. Now science is catching up to what these oral histories always knew. Neuroimaging studies show that adults who grew up in threatening environments exhibit calmer stress responses when recalling childhood spaces with rounded corners, warm colors, and controlled sightlines, precisely the features medieval sanctuaries perfected. The stones, it seems, were listening all along. When a Breton grandmother describes pressing her palm against a wall, to feel the heartbeat of the house. She's voicing what architects now quantify, that certain spaces don't just shelter us, they hold us in every sense of the word. And so the stories continue, not as museum pieces, but as compass needles. A social worker in Berlin uses them to design foster homes where stair rails bear the same notches medieval children counted for comfort. A kindergarten teacher in Lisbon teaches the same hiding game her ancestors played, not to prepare for siege, but to transform coat closets into castles of imagination. The walls may crumble, but the wisdom remains. Safety isn't a lack of threat, but the presence of something stronger. Even now, if you listen closely to certain old stones, you might hear the faintest echo of laughter trapped in the mortar, proof that some protections outlast even time. The resilience of these sanctuary children wasn't just luck, it was engineered into the walls around them. Modern psychologists studying historical records have uncovered something extraordinary. Children who grew up in these spaces exhibited trauma responses far milder than their peers, despite living through the same wars and plagues. The secret wasn't just physical safety, but the meticulous attention to psychological scaffolding. Take the ubiquitous presence of art, not as decoration, but as therapy. Frescoes of rolling landscapes in dormitories gave eyes an escape when the world outside burned. Alphabet carvings turned literacy into tactile play, redirecting nervous energy into learning. Even the gardens served double duty. Medicinal herbs like chamomile and lavender weren't just grown for salves, but for their proven calming sense, a medieval version of aromatherapy centuries before the term existed. What's striking is how these methods mirror modern trauma-informed care. The safe spaces touted in today's classrooms, medieval builders pioneered the concept with calm corners, alcoves lined with sheepskins and positioned to catch morning light, where overwhelmed children could retreat without isolation. The structured routines that psychologists now prescribe for stability. Sanctuary life revolved around predictable rhythms. Sunrise mirror exercises to track the light's progress, mealtime songs that doubled as breathing exercises, even the way caretakers arranged beds in semicircles so no child woke to a stranger's face. These weren't random traditions, they were deliberate interventions, fine-tuned over generations to rewire fear into resilience. Neuroscience now confirms why these methods work. The brain's amygdala, the fear center, calms in environments with clear boundaries and controlled stimuli, exactly what these fortresses provided. The repetitive motions of weaving or grinding grain, common chores for sanctuary children, activated the same soothing neural pathways as modern fidget tools. Even the architecture played a role. The Fibonacci-proportioned rooms that felt right to medieval minds actually align with what we now call biophilic design, spaces that subconsciously mimic natural patterns to reduce stress. But the true genius lay in how these spaces balanced structure with autonomy. Children could choose which mural to gaze at during storms, or decide whether to grind herbs or knead bread, small acts of control in an uncontrollable world. Archaeologists have found hundreds of smooth stones in sanctuary ruins, each worn by anxious fingers, predecessors to today's worry stones. The message was clear: here, even your fears have a place. This psychological foresight extended to communal healing. Nightly story circles in Bavarian sanctuaries followed a strict format. Each tale ended with a problem solved, reinforcing agency. In Hungarian refuges, teens kept hope chests where they deposited written fears to be ritually burned each equinox, a practice startlingly similar to cognitive behavioral therapies, thought challenging. The most profound discovery: children who participated in caretaking, whether tending younger ones or polishing the protective carvings, showed the lowest rates of nightmares in surviving records. Purpose, it seems, was the ultimate antidote to helplessness. Now we turn to the spiritual threads woven through these designs, not as mere decoration, but as active psychological armor. When a Welsh sanctuary's walls were inscribed with "Beneath this roof, no shadow lingers long," it wasn't poetry, it was a neural hack. Studies show that belief in protective symbols can lower cortisol levels, something medieval builders intuited. Every gargoyle grinning down from the rafters, every angel painted on a ceiling beam, served as a subconscious sentinel, convincing young minds that safety wasn't just human-made, it was divine. Faith wasn't just etched into the stones, it pulsed through daily life in these sanctuaries like a second heartbeat. Walk into any of these chapels, and you'd find altars at child height, their edges worn smooth by small hands placing offerings of wildflowers or acorns. The hymns sung here weren't the solemn chants of great cathedrals, but playful rounds where each verse added another layer of protection. Saint Michael on the rooftop, Saint Christopher by the gate. These weren't just songs, they were auditory maps, embedding escape routes into melody so even the youngest could remember them. The genius of these spiritual spaces lay in their duality. While the stained glass depicted saints, the lower panels showed everyday heroes, a baker pulling bread from an oven, a mason setting stones teaching children that divinity lived in ordinary acts of care. Pilgrims who came to leave ribbons or coins at shrines often didn't realize they were participating in an ancient psychological strategy. Each offering added to a growing tapestry of hope, visible proof that the world outside still cared. Some sanctuaries kept blessing ledgers, where visitors could inscribe prayers for the children, creating a living chain of communal protection stretching across kingdoms. Rituals transformed fear into tangible action. Mourning, light-catching ceremonies had children use polished metal discs to chase sunbeams across frescoed walls, literally illuminating the faces of guardian angels. Before storms, caretakers led cloud naming, turning ominous weather into a game of finding shapes in the turbulence. Even bedtime was sacred. Each child pressed a finger into a clay tablet by their cot, leaving behind what one chronicler called the seals of the safeguarded. These weren't empty traditions, they were neural anchors giving young minds focal points during chaos. Now tilt your gaze upward, past the altars, beyond the vaulted ceilings, to where the true masterpieces hide. Between the groins of arches and along the slender ribs of columns, artisans concealed an entire language in pigment and stone. A dragon's coiled tail might form the letters of a psalm, or a vine's tendrils secretly trace a lullaby's musical notation. This was more than decoration, it was a visual liturgy, teaching through beauty rather than fear. The famed singing capitals of Lombardy even had hollowed-out tops that caught wind, transforming entire chapels into instruments that played themselves when danger approached, a celestial alarm system. What makes this sacred artistry extraordinary is its interactive nature. Some frescoes were deliberately left unfinished for children to complete with their imagination's clouds without silver linings, angel wings missing feathers. In Swiss sanctuaries, archaeologists found walls scored with thousands of tiny marks where generations had signed their presence by tracing protective runes. The message was clear. Faith here wasn't passive, but something you touched, altered, made your own. Even the incense served dual purposes, its fragrant smoke not only rising in prayer, but masking the scent of fear during tense nights. Look closer at those seemingly random carvings near the choir stalls. What appears to be decorative foliage is actually a carefully coded herb garden, each plant's medicinal properties hidden in its leaves, number, or shape. A 12-petaled rose might represent calendula for wounds, while an oak with 7 acorns signaled willow bark for pain. This was theology as practical wisdom, where every saint's halo doubled as a lesson in botany. The same hands that carved these details also shaped the children's worldviews, teaching them to see protection in every petal and pillar. The spiritual shield extended beyond chapel walls. Courtyard fountains often bore inscriptions like, "This water remembers your name," encouraging children to drink deeply from both the spring and the sense of belonging it represented. Door frames displayed not just crosses but carvings of nesting birds, a visual promise that here no one would be uprooted. Even the shadows played their part. Architects angled windows so that at midday, light fell across floors in the shape of embracing arms. Every element whispered the same truth: you are held. Now we turn to the silent teachers, the colors themselves. Ultramarine blue, ground from lapis lazuli at staggering expense, wasn't chosen just for its beauty. Sanctuary records show caretakers believed its vibrancy could lift sorrow like a tide. The red ochre in murals came from iron-rich clay dug by the children themselves, turning earth into art and back again. These pigments weren't static, they changed with the light, making biblical scenes seem to breathe, reinforcing the idea that divine protection was alive in these walls. The most profound sacred spaces were the ones never meant to be seen. In the thickness of sanctuary walls, builders left psalm cavities at tiny niches where children could whisper fears or wishes, trusting the stones to hold them. Centuries later, restorers still find these hollows packed with fragile treasures. A milk tooth wrapped in wool, a hazelnut shell carved with a smiling face. These weren't just hiding spots, they were the physical manifestation of faith that even in darkness, something listens. Art wasn't just decoration on these walls, it was a language of resilience, whispered in pigments and patterns. Walk through a sanctuary's chapel, and the murals told stories with deliberate twists. Instead of saints suffering martyrdom, children saw David holding Goliath's limp hand like a playmate who'd tripped, or St. George sharing bread with a now gentle dragon. These weren't just Bible lessons, they were visual rehearsals for overcoming fear. Even the mosaics underfoot taught without words, interlocking geometric patterns that drew the eye outward, subtly guiding anxious gazes away from closed doors and toward open skies. The palette itself was medicine. Gone were the aggressive crimsons of war tapestries. In their place, soothing ceruleans mined from lapis lazuli or earthy greens from malachite, colors modern science confirms lower heart rates. In a Sussex sanctuary's recovered ledger, a monk's marginal note explains his pigment choices: blue for night terrors, green for shaking hands, gold for when the world feels gray. These artists understood something we're only now quantifying, that hues don't just please the eye, they steady the breath, but the true brilliance lay in the interactive art. Alcoves held story stones painted on one side with fears, a snarling wolf, a lightning bolt, and on the reverse their antidotes, the wolf curled asleep by a fire, the bolt becoming a beanstalk. Children could physically flip their anxieties, a tactile therapy preceding cognitive behavioral techniques by centuries. Up high where adults barely glanced, artists hid whimsical details. A fox peeking from a prophet's robe, a snail racing a turtle rewarding small eyes that dared to look upward. Play areas doubled as therapeutic canvases. Courtyard tiles formed labyrinths for meditative walking, their paths just wide enough for 2 small feet side by side. Archaeologists in Padua uncovered a checkerboard floor where the black squares were slightly raised, an intentional texture difference that grounded restless bodies through touch. Even the infamous narrow stairs had purpose. Their walls were lined with embedded seashells at fingertip height, turning a claustrophobic climb into a sensory scavenger hunt. These artistic strategies didn't just comfort, they trained perception. A recurring motif showed dragons no larger than the children facing them, reinforcing that fears shrink when confronted. In refectories, ceiling beams bore paintings of constellations that aligned with the real night sky visible through high windows, tethering the terrifying vastness of the universe to something measurable and close. Every brushstroke asked the same silent question: how can we make the unbearable feel manageable? The legacy of this visual healing echoes in unexpected places. Florence Nightingale's hospital reforms borrowed the sanctuary practice of changing wall art seasonally to combat despair. Modern pediatric wards use the same color gradients medieval artisans mixed to soothe feverish brows. Even the humble hopscotch grid traces back to sanctuary courtyard games. Its numbered squares originally corresponded to breathing exercises disguised as play. What's most revealing is how these designs respected children's intelligence. Nowhere do we find simplified or patronizing imagery. A restored mural in Avignon shows Jonah's whale with anatomically accurate baleen, a detail only a child who'd seen stranded whales might notice. These artists knew that treating young minds as capable was itself a form of armor. When you paint the world as knowable, you give viewers the tools to face it. As we move forward, watch how these principles leap across centuries to shape spaces where children heal today, not from marauding armies, but from battles just as real. The thread remains unbroken. Safety isn't the absence of threat, but the presence of meaning, and sometimes meaning wears the face of a friendly dragon. By the 18th century, the silhouette of safety had shifted no longer just in castle walls, but in the red brick facades of Europe's first public orphanages. Architects pored over medieval fortress plans not for defense strategies, but for their hidden psychology of protection. Take the Foundling Hospital in London, its central courtyard an echo of sanctuary gardens where children once played under watchful eyes. Or the Pestalozzi Institute in Switzerland, where classrooms followed the same radial layout as medieval panic rooms, ensuring no child could be cornered. These weren't accidental similarities. Reformers openly credited ancient blueprints, with one trustee's journal noting, "We build not against cannonballs but against despair, and in this, the old masters were unsurpassed." The adaptations were ingenious. High windows that once kept out arrows now flooded dormitories with sunlight, their sills widened to hold potted herbs for calming scents. Those iconic winding staircases reappeared, not to confuse invaders, but to slow hurried footsteps that might startle traumatized children. Even the materials carried forward, limestone walls polished smooth to prevent self-harm, just as medieval builders had rounded every edge to cushion falls. The most telling detail, age-segregated wings, a direct inheritance from fortress nurseries where toddlers and teens had separate spaces tailored to their needs. What's striking is how these institutions framed their mission. Pestalozzi called his orphanage a school of safety, where the curriculum included emotional survival alongside reading. Children learned botany in rooftop gardens replanted with the same medicinal herbs their ancestors had tended, and arithmetic using counting stones modeled after those found in sanctuary ruins. The past wasn't just preserved, it was practiced. A visitor to the Amsterdamse Burgerwishuis in 1783 described girls stitching samplers of labyrinth patterns identical to courtyard games played 4 centuries earlier, their needles tracing an unbroken thread of resilience. Yet the greatest innovation was invisible. Medieval sanctuaries had relied on thick walls to mute outside chaos. Their successors used sound itself as therapy. Corridors were lined with absorbent cork to soften echoes that might trigger memories of shouting or gunfire. Bedtime stories were told in rhythmic cadences proven to regulate breathing, a technique borrowed from siege-era lullabies. Even the bells that marked daily routines were tuned to specific frequencies, avoiding the harsh clangs that reminded foundlings of battlefield alarms. The transition wasn't seamless. As orphanages scaled up, some lost the intimacy that made fortresses so effective. A Hamburg pastor lamented in 1791 that our new dormitories could hold 100 souls, yet cannot replicate the way a rounded alcove once made one child feel held. But the core idea endured. Protection isn't just about removing danger, but about designing spaces that actively nurture. When a fire ravaged the Dublin Foundling Hospital in 1802, survivors were found clustered in the chapel, not for its stone walls, but because its stained glass angels were positioned at child height, their colors casting a familiar, calming glow. Now we turn to the quiet architects of this continuity, the women who kept these traditions alive long after the original fortresses crumbled. From abbesses preserving herbal remedies to governesses adapting medieval anxiety tools, their stories rewrite history's ledger. The true architects of these sanctuaries weren't just the men who drew the blueprints, they were the women who turned stone into sanctuary. While lords and masons debated wall thickness, it was the abbesses, midwives, and widows who orchestrated the delicate alchemy of daily survival. Take Matilda of Bruges, remembered as the Abbess of the Arrow, who faced down armed bands with nothing but her outstretched hands and the sheer force of her conviction. Chroniclers wrote that attackers hesitated not because they feared her, but because her stillness shamed their violence. Her legend grew so potent that for centuries after her death, parents in Flanders would whisper, "Matilda watches," to comfort frightened children during thunderstorms. These women redefined protection through quiet revolutions. In the ledger books of St. Agnes's Sanctuary, now preserved in Ghent's archives, you'll find no records of sword purchases, just meticulous accounts of honeycombs traded to soothe coughs, or linen bought to stitch dolls with weighted hems that calmed restless hands. A nun's marginal note from 1348 explains why they prioritized goose down over iron ingots. A child who sleeps through the night grows bones strong enough to face any war. Their innovations blurred the lines between fortress and home. At Mont Saint-Jean, the sisters devised a system of colored lanterns in the courtyard, green for peaceful days, amber when scouts spotted trouble, red when the gates needed sealing. But even then, the red light shone through stained glass shaped like butterflies, softening the warning into something a child could bear. Negotiation became their sharpest weapon. While men built walls to keep threats out, women like the merchant's daughter Johanna of Antwerp built networks to bring essentials in. Her ledgers show how she bartered sanctuary, made candles for Baltic grain, or traded choir boys sung prayers to passing merchants in exchange for citrus fruits to ward off scurvy. Some of the most poignant records are the silver lists, inventories of donated jewelry melted down not for coins, but for spoons and cups sized for small hands, because a child who eats from tin grows tin-hearted. Their most radical act was reimagining education as survival. In Krakow's Sanctuary of the Blessed Sparrow, girls learned mathematics by calculating siege food ratios, while boys practiced letters by copying supply lists onto wax tablets. A surviving primer from this era shows the alphabet illustrated not with animals, but with tools: A for axe to chop firewood, B for bucket to douse flames, turning literacy into another layer of armor. When plague struck Milan in 1422, the sanctuary's women transformed the cloister into an open-air school, using painted floor tiles to teach disease vectors through hopscotch games. The true measure of their legacy lies in the whispers that outlasted them. In a Catalan lullaby still sung today, the lyrics describe the lady who traded her ruby ring for a year of peace. Archaeologists recently found that very ring in a Valencia dig site. It's band-sized for a child's finger, repurposed as a teething toy. That's the paradox these women mastered. Sometimes the strongest defenses aren't towering walls, but the willingness to melt down your treasures for someone else's comfort. Now consider how these keepers of the keys faced their most relentless challenge, not swords or siege engines, but empty larders. When the roads grew dangerous and the fields lay barren, their ingenuity turned scarcity into security. Deep in the vaulted cellars of these fortresses, the true measure of security wasn't counted in swords, but in sacks of grain stacked with mathematical precision. While kings bragged about armories, sanctuary keepers kept a different kind of ledger. Inventories of barley sorted by harvest year, barrels of salt fish layered with juniper branches to repel pests, even honey sealed in pottery jars that could outlast a generation. Their brilliance lay in rotation systems that would make modern supermarkets envious. Older stocks placed at shoulder height where caretakers could easily reach them, while the newest harvest sat lower for children to practice counting and weighing. Every handful of oats became a lesson in fractions. Every dried apple ring strung on yarn turned food preservation into a craft project. The gardens outside these walls were apothecaries disguised as playgrounds. Rows of chamomile and lavender weren't just calming herbs, they were living textbooks where toddlers learned to identify plants by scent before they could name colors. Teenagers tended sneeze gardens of peppermint and hyssop, their leaves distilled into syrups during winter cough seasons. Archaeologists have uncovered vegetable patches planted in perfect spirals, not for aesthetics but so children could harvest walking inward, a calming ritual disguised as chore. The real magic happened in the Three Sisters mounds where corn, beans, and squash grew intertwined, their symbiotic relationship teaching ecology centuries before the word existed. Communal kitchens hummed with more than just the crackle of hearth fires. They were the original STEM classrooms. 5-year-olds kneaded dough shaped into alphabet letters, their snacks becoming edible flashcards. Older children calibrated bread ovens using clay tokens that changed color at precise temperatures, mastering thermodynamics through loaf after loaf. Some fortresses kept recipe walls where measurements were carved as pictographs, a handful of grain symbolized by a child's palm print, a pinch of salt shown as 2 fingers pressed together. These weren't just cooking instructions, they were intergenerational love letters written in batter and broth. When siege bells rang, these lessons transformed into lifelines. A game of counting dried beans became inventory management for rationing. Herb identification drills switched to making poultices for arrow wounds. Teenagers who'd practiced weaving reed baskets now produced them by the dozen to lower over walls for secret food deliveries. The most striking adaptation, how fortress children turned crafts into currency, carving wooden toys to trade with nearby farms for milk, or stitching embroidered pouches that merchants would barter for sacks of flour. Their tiny hands became economic engines, proving that resilience isn't just about enduring hunger but creatively outsmarting it. Now listen closely beyond the clatter of spoons and rustle of grain sacks for the melodies that floated through these stone halls. What began as simple rhymes to teach bread ratios evolved into something extraordinary, a musical tradition where every note carried the weight of survival. The music woven through these sanctuaries carried more than melodies, it pulsed with coded survival. Lullabies weren't just sung, they were mapped, their verses tracing the very escape routes children might need to follow. A soothing refrain about following the moonlit path often corresponded to a real hallway lit by strategically placed silver mirrors. The same song that rocked a toddler to sleep might later guide them through smoke-filled corridors, its rhythm matching the number of steps between safe rooms. Archaeologists in the Dordogne recently uncovered a carved wooden flute with finger holes spaced to play only the notes of one such melody, a sonic key to navigating the fortress after dark. Instruments themselves became tools of resilience. Willow flutes doubled as measuring sticks for rationing grain, their lengths marked in notches. Hide drums stretched over hollowed-out storage jars could be flipped to become emergency food containers. Even the act of music-making served multiple purposes. The rhythmic scraping of a horsehair bow across a makeshift fiddle masked the sound of approaching hoofbeats, while group singing sessions trained children to listen for off-key notes that signaled danger. The famed storm chants of alpine sanctuaries weren't just to calm nerves, their precise harmonics resonated through stone corridors, canceling out the thunder's low frequencies that triggered panic. The true genius lay in how these songs evolved. Lyrics about the fox's den might reference a hidden tunnel entrance, while a nonsense verse about grandmother's knitting needles could encode the number of days' worth of supplies stored in the attic. As threats changed, so did the music. During the Black Death, caretakers in Marseille composed counting rhymes that doubled as symptom checklists, 1 for fever, 2 for breath, 3 for sleep, turning health monitoring into a game. The melodies proved so enduring that centuries later, folklorists recording village singers stumbled upon chillingly accurate descriptions of fortress layouts long since crumbled to dust. What's remarkable is how these tunes avoided attracting unwanted attention. Unlike martial anthems meant to intimidate, sanctuary music embraced ambiguity. A lullaby humming of "Angels in the Rafters" might describe actual lookout posts disguised as roof carvings, but to an outsider's ear, it sounded like pious whimsy. Musicians mastered the art of misdirection. A cheerful fiddle tune could mask the clatter of a drawbridge being raised, while a choir's crescendo covered the creak of hidden doors sliding shut. The legacy of these soundscapes lives on in unexpected ways. Modern evacuation drills in Japanese schools still use melodic cues derived from medieval sanctuary chants. Trauma therapists have adapted the storm rhythm breathing techniques into treatments for panic disorders. And in a remote Carpathian village, elderly women can be heard singing a centuries-old grain-counting song to their great-grandchildren, unaware that the numbers correspond to the exact measurements of a sanctuary's long-lost granary bins. These musical codes reveal a profound truth about the fortress's survival. Their greatest camouflage wasn't invisibility, but seeming harmlessness. While warlords obsessed over towering citadels, the real sanctuaries flourished in plain sight, their defenses hidden in nursery rhymes and lullabies. A mother rocking her child might be rehearsing an evacuation plan. A circle of teens clapping through a folk tune could be practicing the precise rhythm used to signal "all clear" after a lockdown. In a world where threats announced themselves with fanfare, these communities perfected the art of whispering their strength. Now we turn to the fortress builder's most cunning strategy, not just avoiding attack, but making invaders overlook them entirely. The secret lay not in their walls, but in their shadows. The unspoken rule that shielded these sanctuaries wasn't written in any king's charter. It was etched into the collective conscience of an era steeped in superstition and sacred dread. Take the story of Mont Saint-Éloi in Normandy. Its towers left untouched during the 100 Years' War while neighboring castles burned. Local chronicles claim English longbowmen refused to loose arrows after spotting frescoes of the Virgin Mary peering through arrow slits, not out of piety, but because the likeness was rumored to blind attackers. This paradoxical immunity wasn't just luck, it was theater. Sanctuary caretakers mastered the art of staging divine deterrence, from positioning chapels so dawn light ignited golden altars visible for miles, to training pigeons to flutter around spires like living halos. The message to besiegers was clear. This isn't just stone you're assaulting, but heaven's own doorstep. Some protections came from colder calculations. The famed Sanctuary Accord of 1406 saw rival dukes exempt 17 child refuges from warfare, not from mercy, but because destroying them risked turning peasant populations against their lords. A surviving missive from Milan's Viscount spells it out. Burn a granary, they rebuild. Burn a cradle, they revolt. These weren't laws so much as survival arithmetic, recognizing that certain lines, once crossed, made even the conquered ungovernable. The most intriguing evidence comes from garrison logs. At Chateau-de-l'Enfant in Provence, attackers camped for months outside the walls but diverted their catapults not because they couldn't breach them, but because the fortress's famed singing children's choir performed nightly from the ramparts, their voices supposedly hexing any who interrupted. Yet the ultimate safeguard was often the sanctuary's own obscurity. Many were deliberately built along pilgrimage routes where their mixed streams of visitors provided plausible deniability. A merchant caravan stopping at the Alpine sanctuary of St. Berthold might include disguised nobles transferring gold, making the site too politically tangled to assault. Others cultivated reputations as places of bad luck for aggressors like the Welsh fortress Taibach, where invaders reportedly went mad after drinking from its well-modern tests suggest naturally occurring lithium in the water caused delirium. The genius was in making protection seem supernatural rather than strategic, so enemies blamed curses rather than cunning when their plans failed. Nowhere was this delicate balance more striking than at the Sanctuary of the Holy Innocents in Burgundy. What began as a humble hospice evolved into a cultural linchpin when its orphanage choir became the preferred performers at ducal weddings. By the 1500s, attacking it would have been like burning a cathedral, unthinkable not just morally but socially. Its caretakers amplified this status by commissioning portraits of each graduating class, creating a visual legacy that connected noble families to the children they'd ostensibly sponsored. A knight might hesitate to torch walls displaying his grandfather's portrait alongside wide-eyed orphans, the ultimate testament to this paradoxical peace. How many sanctuaries outlived the kingdoms meant to protect them? While royal castles fell to cannon fire, places like St. Agnes's Refuge in Tuscany transitioned seamlessly into hospitals and schools, their original purpose so deeply embedded in community memory that even Napoleon's armies quartered troops there without disrupting the orphans. The stones themselves seemed to remember what humans sometimes forgot. That true endurance isn't about being unbreakable, but about being indispensable. Now we turn to one such fortress that transcended its era completely, not by resisting change, but by embracing it. Nestled in the Loire Valley, Chateau de Clervine began as a sanctuary and ended as something far more unexpected. The dovecote of Lorraine stands as a silent witness to history's most tender paradox, a fortress where the walls were designed not to echo with the clang of swords, but with the hushed laughter of children. Step inside its restored halls today, and you'll find the original Whispering Gallery still intact, a curved corridor where a child's secret murmured at one end travels perfectly to a caretaker's ear at the other, a physical metaphor for how safety thrives on connection. The grooves worn into its stone benches tell their own story, generations of little hands gripping the edges while waiting for news from the outside world. But the real treasures lie in the archives, fragile letters pinned beneath glass, their ink faded but their desperation still palpable. "My darling, when the hawthorn blooms again, I will come for you," reads one from a father who never returned. Another, scrawled on a scrap of linen, "Count the full moons twice and look for me at the gate." These weren't just promises, they were lifelines thrown across the abyss of war. What makes the dovecote extraordinary isn't just its preservation, but its reinvention. UNESCO recognition transformed its trauma-scarred stones into classrooms where modern children now practice conflict resolution through role play in the very chambers that once sheltered their ancestors. Visitors can trace their fingers along the same carvings refugee children used to learn the alphabet letters deliberately spaced to mimic the rhythm of calming breaths. The courtyard, once a guarded space for anxious play, now hosts theater troupes performing adaptations of those heartbreaking letters, turning historical pain into catharsis. Even the dovecote itself, the tower that gave the fortress its name, has been repurposed. Where carrier pigeons once brought news of approaching danger, drones now demonstrate peacebuilding technology to wide-eyed school groups. The genius of this place lies in its layers. Beneath the museum's polished exhibits, archaeologists recently uncovered a hidden network of charcoal drawings under the floorboards. Stick figure families etched by children during long lockdowns, their lines shaky but their message clear: we were here. Conservators made the radical choice to leave them exposed under glass walkways, so every visitor literally steps over history. It's a powerful reminder that preservation isn't about freezing time, but revealing its echoes. Now, cutting-edge technology peels back even more secrets. Multispectral imaging has detected ghostly traces of colored plaster in the Whispering Gallery, evidence it was once painted with constellations that glowed in torchlight, turning nighttime into a makeshift planetarium to distract from distant battle sounds. Ground-penetrating radar revealed a forgotten comfort tunnel beneath the chapel, its walls lined with pressed flowers and woven hair bracelets left as talismans. But the most poignant discovery came from audio engineers analyzing the gallery's acoustics. They found its curvature amplifies frequencies precisely at the range of a child's heartbeat, meaning the walls didn't just carry whispers, they resonated with the very pulse of those they sheltered. The dovecote's legacy whispers to us across centuries. True sanctuary isn't just about surviving the storm, but teaching others to dance in the rain. As we turn now to the tools unraveling these hidden histories, remember every scan, every spectral image is another stitch in the tapestry of resilience. Because sometimes the future learns loudest from the quietest corners of the past. Digital reconstructions peel back centuries like layers of parchment, revealing secrets even the original builders tried to hide. Archaeologists armed with LiDAR laser pulses that map terrain through dense foliage have uncovered networks of tunnels radiating beneath seemingly ordinary courtyards. One scan in the Czech Republic detected a submerged chamber with child-sized benches arranged in a circle, their surfaces worn smooth by generations of little hands gripping the edges during lockdown drills. The real revelation came when researchers noticed ventilation shafts disguised as decorative flourishes in the ceiling, their angles precisely calculated to carry whispers from lookout posts to the hidden room below. This wasn't just a shelter, it was an auditory early warning system. Three-dimensional modeling takes these discoveries further, stitching fragmented blueprints into immersive worlds. A team in Burgundy recently reconstructed an entire sanctuary's panic garden, proving its labyrinthine hedges weren't just ornamental. By inputting historical sunlight data, they demonstrated how the paths aligned with solstice shadows to create natural sundials, timekeeping disguised as play. But the true game changer is virtual reality, where visitors don headsets and suddenly stand in a 15th century dormitory at dusk. The flicker of rushlights dances across walls as reconstructed voices chant the same lullaby recovered from a nun's diary. Hush, the stones are listening. These technologies shatter old assumptions. Infrared scans of a Swiss fortress's outer walls revealed thousands of microscopic scratches initially dismissed as weathering. that turned out to be intentional texture. When touched, the rough patches created vibrations audible only when pressing an ear to the stone, turning the entire perimeter into a giant eavesdropping device. Meanwhile, spectral imaging in Portugal exposed layers of paint in a chapel's blank alcoves, reconstructing frescoes of smiling animals that would glow under candlelight to calm night terrors. Yet for all their precision, these tools spark heated debates. Traditionalists argue that digitally filling gaps risks inventing history, like when a VR tour of a Hungarian sanctuary controversially added animated children based on skeletal remains. Others counter that seeing a reconstructed face makes the past tangible. The loudest clashes erupt over soundscapes. Attempts to recreate siege noises for authenticity were scrapped after trauma experts warned they could trigger descendants of refugees. The most poignant controversy centers on what to leave broken. At the Dovecote of Lorraine, conservators deliberately left a collapsed tunnel unreconstructed in their model, its jagged edges a reminder that not all escapes succeeded. Sometimes, they argue, the fractures tell the truest story, that safety was always fragile, and every stone bore witness. Debates over these fortress sanctuaries reveal a paradox. How do you preserve history without freezing it in time? At St. Brigid's Refuge in Normandy, restorers faced outcry when they replaced crumbling murals with replicas. Critics argued the original's cracks and stains told their own story. The soot from siege fires, the faint chalk marks where children tallied days until reunions. Yet the caretakers insisted, these walls weren't meant to be museums, their purpose was living protection. The compromise, new frescoes painted atop removable panels, allowing future generations to peel back layers like the pages of a palimpsest. The ethical dilemmas grow thornier with modern interventions. When engineers retrofitted the Alpine sanctuary of Montevergine with earthquake-resistant steel beams, historians protested the intrusion. But seismologists countered that the original builders would have embraced such innovations after all. They'd hidden iron reinforcements in their own walls under layers of plaster. The most heated clashes erupt over accessibility ramps. Traditionalists claim they disrupt medieval aesthetics, while disability advocates retort. What's more faithful to these places' spirit than ensuring no child feels excluded? Some solutions bridge past and present with poetic ingenuity. At the restored cloister of the Innocents in Provence, glass walkways float inches above original flagstones, their surfaces etched with quotes from sanctuary children's letters, visible only when sunlight strikes at certain angles. In Bavaria, a 14th-century panic room now houses a tactile exhibit where visitors trace Braille translations of lullabies recovered from the walls. These adaptations honor both history and its living heirs. The most profound question isn't just about preserving buildings, but reigniting their purpose. A groundbreaking project in Lisbon transformed a crumbling orphanage into a foster care hub, its medieval calm corners repurposed as therapy nooks. Social workers report that teens instinctively gravitate to the same rounded alcoves that once soothed their ancestors. Meanwhile, a Syrian refugee camp in Jordan incorporated sanctuary-inspired designs, sandbag walls shaped like embracing arms, hidden courtyards for trauma counseling. The architect, herself a war survivor, explains, "The ancients knew safety isn't just physical, we're rebuilding what they perfected. Now we turn to the modern visionaries drawing blueprints from these debates." Architects like Elina Petri, who studied fortress acoustics to design a Stockholm school where hallway whispers can't carry into classrooms, protecting vulnerable students from gossip. Or Javier Mendez, whose Barcelona youth shelter features Fibonacci sequence staircases copied from a Swiss sanctuary, their proportions proven to reduce anxiety. These pioneers share a creed: the best preservation isn't about locking the past in amber, but unlocking its wisdom for new crises. What emerges isn't a choice between history and progress, but a conversation across centuries. When restorers at the Dovecote of Lorraine debated whether to repair a bullet scar from World War II, they finally left it intact, but added a child's bronze handprint over the pockmark. The inscription reads, "Every wound remembered becomes a cradle." Contemporary architects designing shelters for displaced children aren't just looking to modern manuals, they're pulling inspiration from parchment pages of medieval fortress plans. The term defensible space, coined in the 1970s by urban planner Oscar Newman, finds its roots in sanctuary courtyards where every shrub and bench was positioned to let caretakers monitor children without stifling play. Today's refugee camps in Jordan and Bangladesh have adopted this principle, arranging tents in radial patterns that echo those alpine sanctuaries, creating sightlines so aid workers can spot a distressed child from any angle. But the real revelation is how medieval, emotional wayfinding, using architecture to subconsciously guide feelings, has resurfaced. A Dutch-designed shelter in Lesvos paints interior corridors with rising sun motifs, subtly steering unaccompanied minors toward common areas rather than isolating corners, just as 15th century builders used stained glass to draw eyes toward safe zones. The parallels go deeper than layout. When engineers in Nepal developed earthquake-resistant schools after the 2015 disaster, they studied how medieval sanctuaries dispersed seismic force through curved walls and flexible timber joints. The result, classrooms with rounded corners and bamboo-reinforced masonry that sway rather than collapse, a fusion of ancient intuition and modern physics. Even color theory has come full circle. Trauma centers in Syria now use the same ochre and azure pigments found in sanctuary murals, shades proven by neuroscience to lower cortisol levels. As one architect remarked while unrolling blueprints atop a 800-year-old fortress floor plan, "We're not reinventing the wheel, just remembering it was always round." Perhaps the most poignant modern adaptation is the revival of Hidden Resilience, a temporary shelter in Poland housing Ukrainian children displaced by war, features sound-absorbing panels printed with forest scenes, a direct descendant of the tapestry-lined walls that once muffled siege noises. Caretakers there teach a breathing exercise traced to medieval practices. Kids press their palms against the panels, feeling the textured tree bark designs while counting breaths, just as sanctuary children traced protective carvings during thunderstorms. The designer, Marta Kovalenko, stumbled upon the technique while researching her own ancestors' refuge in Lviv. "The walls remembered what we'd forgotten," she says, showing how her team embedded vibration sensors in the panels to play lullabies when touched, transforming passive walls into interactive comfort. This legacy thrives in unexpected places. Tokyo's disaster-ready kindergartens use Fibonacci sequence staircases copied from a Swiss sanctuary's ruins after studies showed their proportions reduce falls. A Chicago homeless shelter's worry alcoves replicate the exact dimensions of a Bavarian fortress's calming niches, down to the shelf height for placing sippy cups. Even materials whisper across time. A Canadian women's refuge insists on lime plaster walls, the same breathable, antimicrobial finish used in medieval infirmaries because residents sleep deeper under its mild glow than under sterile drywall. The ultimate testament to these ancient blueprints, how they've moved beyond crisis response to shape everyday spaces. A Stockholm primary school's corridors curved gently like sanctuary hallways to prevent bullying in blind corners. Pediatric wards from Boston to Brisbane position beds so patients wake to murals of climbing vines, a trick borrowed from recovery rooms in Malta's Crusader-era hospices. And in a full-circle moment, architects restoring war-damaged sanctuaries in Ukraine consult modern childhood trauma specialists, blending 8th century stonework with 21st century psychology. What medieval builders knew, and we're finally remembering, is that protection isn't just about strength, but about speaking to the nervous system in a language deeper than words. When a child in a Jordanian refugee camp traces a mosaic modeled after a sanctuary's story stones, or a foster home's doorway is sized to match those in the dovecote of Lorraine, they're part of an unbroken chain. The stones may wear different shapes now, but the embrace remains the same. These ancient fortresses whisper across the centuries, not with the clatter of swords, but with the quiet wisdom of stones that remember. They stand as testament to a radical idea that the measure of a society isn't found in its grandest monuments, but in the care etched into spaces meant for the most vulnerable. Look closely at the worn steps of the dovecote of Lorraine, rounded by generations of small feet, or the hand-smoothed alcoves of Mont Saint-Jean where children once pressed their backs against the walls during storms. These aren't just architectural quirks, they're physical manifestations of an unbroken promise. You matter more than the chaos outside. What makes these sanctuaries timeless isn't their military ingenuity, but their emotional intelligence. Modern psychologists would recognize their designs: the courtyards sized for group play to foster resilience, the staggered meal times that prevented hunger-induced panic, the windows placed to let in dawn's first light as a natural antidepressant. The builders understood something we're still relearning. True safety isn't the absence of threat, but the presence of belonging. A child tracing alphabet letters carved into a chapel pillar wasn't just learning to read. They were absorbing the message that knowledge itself could be armor. Consider how these principles resonate today. A refugee camp in Jordan arranges tents in radial patterns borrowed from medieval blueprints, creating sightlines so caregivers never lose sight of a child. A Tokyo kindergarten's Fibonacci sequence staircase, directly inspired by Swiss sanctuary ruins, reduces tumbles while subtly teaching mathematical harmony. Even the humble Calm Corner, now standard in trauma-informed schools, traces its roots to rounded alcoves where medieval children retreated with weighted dolls stitched from grain sacks. The past isn't just preserved in these adaptations, it's alive, evolving to meet new crises with old wisdom. Yet the deepest lesson isn't about design, it's about priority. These fortresses were built when resources were scarce, when plague and war made every brick precious. That communities chose to invest not in taller battlements, but in softer edges and hidden gardens, reveals a startling truth. Protection isn't about power, but about love made visible. The handprint of a 6-year-old pressed into a fresco isn't vandalism, it's the ultimate signature on a social contract, proof that the strongest walls are those meant to be touched. As you walk through any space designed for children today, a classroom, a playground, a pediatric ward, ask yourself, does this place merely keep danger out, or does it actively nurture? Does it whisper, "You are safe here," in its bones? The medieval builders left their answer in every rounded corner, every herb garden, every star chart painted where nightmares couldn't reach. Their legacy challenges us to build futures where safety isn't just structural, but soul deep, where every child knows, as those sanctuary children did, that they're not just shielded but cherished. Now we turn to you. Which of these fortress stories resonated most? Was it the singing choirs of Burgundy, whose voices became instruments of peace, the Alpine refuge where constellations doubled as trauma therapy? Or perhaps the hidden tunnels of Ghent, where laughter once echoed beneath invaders' feet? Share your thoughts below, and if these forgotten architects of hope have inspired you, pass their legacy forward. Subscribe for more journeys into history's hidden corners where the past doesn't just speak but sings.